So this is session 3. I'm doing a quick little run through. This feels super awkward, but take 1. I'm going to start with our guiding questions and then jump into redoing some of the parts that I really jacked up before. There might be times where you might not be able to see me because I don't like standing in the front of the room, so I might be moving to the back or a little farther this way. So hopefully you can hear me. So let's get started. All right, can I have 2 volunteers help us read our 2 guiding questions for today? What are my specific social identities and how do they give me privilege and or subject me to oppression in the context of our society? How do my social identities and life experiences show up for me as a teacher and my work with students, families, communities, and colleagues? So this is how we're going to be spending our time today. First, we're going to be talking a little bit about social identities and developing what that means for us. Then we'll be working on our individual identity mapping, so you'll actually get time to work through this on your own and really start articulating and thinking through what that means for you. And then afterwards, we'll look at our identities as a collective, and then at the end, we'll reflect and we'll wrap up, and you'll get to go on to your next session. So can I have somebody read this quote for us? It's a James Baldwin quote. He's one of my favorite thinkers. The questions which one asks oneself begin at least to illuminate the world and become one's key to the experience of others. I want to give you a moment to let that sink in. Center yourself today as you're entering this conversation and thinking through, what does it mean to be me? How is that going to look like in the classroom? How will it present itself in the classroom? And then thinking about what James Baldwin is challenging us to consider today. Why it's so important for us to question who we are so we can begin to understand who others are. So let's break this down a little bit more. So there are 2 types of ways that we identify ourselves, categorize ourselves. The first is social identities, and that's what we're really going to be focusing on this summer, what we're really going to be putting some work into and building this summer. The second is personal affiliation, and they're very similar, but very, very different. And so I think it's important for us to be on the same page with this one, because we can't mix them up when we're developing our identity as teachers and understanding the different power dynamics that might come with certain types of identities. So for social identities, usually it's something that exists or is consistently used to confer power, to get benefits, or maybe it can do the opposite for us. It can create disadvantage, take away benefits, limit access. Usually it's used to explain our differences, the differences in our outcome, in our effort, in our ability. And sometimes this can be something that is immutable, something that we can't help. That's just who we are, how we are. We can't change it. But there are some social identities that we could change, but that would be very costly to change. Meaning it would cost a lot of social capital, maybe actual monetary cost, but it'd be very taxing or expensive for us to change it. And then the other side to this is the personal affiliations, and it's kind of easy to mix these up, but they're actually pretty different. A personal affiliation is usually something that we opt into. We have a choice in. We can choose to be that type of personal affiliation. Perhaps you're not a very great swimmer, and so you want to become a swimmer someday. You want to practice at it, you want to improve upon it, and so one day you'll be able to call yourself a swimmer. For example, my father is a hiker. He leads hikes in Red Rocks, so if you're going to be going to Las Vegas, just let me know. We'll go on some hikes sometime. And I've never been a very good hiker. I'm scared of heights, and I'm also very clumsy. 2 very dangerous things to combine on a hike. But over the last year, I've started hiking more. And so now I can say I'm a hiker. I have blazed trails in Red Rock. But if I woke up one morning and decided to stop hiking, I could do that. And so I wanted to share a couple of my own social identities to hopefully kind of give you an idea of why it is that we're making this distinction today. So when we're thinking about social identities, it's important to know that there are a lot of social identities, a lot of them. And we can be all of these things at the same time because there's a thing called intersectionality that we've spoken about before, and it was in your pre-work, where we're can be a Latinx and a woman all at the same time. But there are times when we enter the room and we feel like one identity might present itself a little bit more than the other, or might stand out more than the other. So for example, I'm a Latina, I'm a woman, and I'm a Latinx. I can't stop being either of those things at any given point, but depending on which room I'm entering, one might stand out more than the other. If I go to a Cárdenas, I know that being a Latina is going to give me the ability to be able to read some of the signs and speak to the people that might be able to help me there. I know if I'm a woman, when I'm entering the workplace, sometimes that presents itself in different ways that can be seen as problematic, right? If I'm very passionate, I can be perceived as emotional. And then there are other social identities that might be by choice. So being a Latina, I was not born in the United States. For me, that's something that's been a very important part of my story. But in this past year, I became a naturalized citizen. That is something that confers me a lot of privilege now. I'm the only person in my family that can vote. I'm the only person in my family that can safely say that I will never be put in danger of deportation as far as paperwork goes. So it's something that I had the choice in. But then there are also other identities that may or may not be observable. You can't immediately tell just by looking at someone. So for example, just by looking at me, you might not necessarily know that I'm a Colombiana and proud. And for some, there are others that are a lot more complicated. Maybe it's whether or not you're able-bodied, whether that's physical or emotional. I'm a person that suffers from anxiety. You probably wouldn't know that from getting to know me at first. That's something that can affect my physical and mental ability to do things, like overcoming heights. So you can't always tell with social identities. And then they may or may not be salient. So salient does not necessarily mean whether or not they're important. It's whether or not we notice them. And so for me, growing up, I've been very privileged in the sense that I'm a heterosexual, cis female, cis woman. I identify with the gender that I was born into. And that has made it a lot easier for me to navigate certain spaces. That's conferred me privilege. When I go into public spaces, I don't have to worry about whether or not people will use the accurate pronouns for me. She, her, hers. Because that's not something I've had to think about. But then there are others that maybe aren't observable, but that I know every time I enter a space, it matters to me. It's something that's always just there in the back of my mind. I'm a police officer's wife. Anytime I enter a business, I know that if I'm going to sit anywhere, my husband has to be sitting somewhere where he can see the exit. I know that depending on what group of people I'm around, I can or cannot disclose what profession my husband is a part of. Those are things I have to think about. They inform how I exist in the world, how I operate in a room. And then I've got all these personal affiliations. I'm a doctoral student at UNLV, super excited about that, super important to me. And I don't want to minimize personal affiliations because they're important, but they're not social identities. They're things that we opt into. If I wanted to tomorrow, I could drop out of school. I'm also a cat dog mom, did that by choice. I adopted these two beautiful fur babies, a German Shepherd and a Maine Coon. If you don't know what a Maine Coon is, you need to Google that when you get home because they're huge. But all of these things are optional for me. They don't necessarily give me more power or less power. Education might confer me more power once I achieve that level. But it's something that I can continue to change, grow in. And so I think this is a part that we kind of really need to understand why. Why does this matter? Why do we need to talk about this stuff? Why do we need to know exactly how we identify? And I think this is something that really helps explain that. It's this idea of positionality, especially with the conversations that we're going to be having this summer. We need to understand how we are entering into a room. Because we need to be able to know what is informing our beliefs, our assumptions, the things we say or don't say. And we also need to understand where other people are coming from. What is their positionality? What's informing them? Where I stand in this room, I'm a Latina, I'm an educator, I'm a police officer's wife, I'm an immigrant, but I'm a citizen. That informs how I exist in this space. And so by being more aware of our social identities, we're able to make sure that we are respectful of one another and that we are also being understanding of where others are coming from. And so when we put all of these social identities together, each social identity can gain privilege or it can cause oppression. And you've probably heard these terms before. They're actually become a lot more common in the last few years, especially with this last election. Conversations about and privilege can be kind of an icky place for us. Sometimes we want to say, we reject this privilege. Maybe I'm middle class now, but growing up I was low income. That's true for me. Maybe I'm a citizen now, but I've only been a citizen for less than a year. Is that fair to say that I get privilege? We need to understand, where are we getting benefits that we haven't necessarily earned, we just inherently receive them. And where are those places where we do receive oppression, where we are oppressed? Where are there systems that are working towards maintaining a status quo that might not necessarily keep us at the top? And so you can receive privilege in some ways and be oppressed in others, and you'll find as you're working through your identity development, you are going to have a lot of both of them, not just one. And if you find yourself leaning more on one spectrum than on the other, it does not determine the value of your character, the value of the type of person that you are. I know as a woman of color, I kind of struggled with this a lot because I thought, I'm a tough girl. I'm not oppressed. I'm not even going to say I'm oppressed. Oppressed, what's that? But I think it's important to understand that when we go out into the world, a reality exists where there are systems that benefit certain people and don't benefit others, that give access to some and not others. And that can sometimes affect how we see the world, our positionality. It can affect what informs our actions as people, our actions as teachers, and how we interact with our students. And we must be fully aware of those things in order to make sure that we are accountable to ourselves and that we are creating spaces where all of our kids can succeed. And that we're not unintentionally creating these systems in our classrooms. So, we are going to be doing an activity where, if you look around the room, there are all these posters. You see them? So we're going to go one poster at a time, and I want you to kind of just start shooting out, what are things that you think might fall under that category of social identity? And as you shout them out, I'm going to be writing them, so just, I'm going to have to keep up with you, all right? All right, so let's start throwing some of them out. Gender, class, race, ethnicity, able-bodied or physicality, other words. And I'm going to kind of do this activity, so I'm just kind of